Hello and welcome to another History Revision video podcast. This one is on British foreign policy in 1945 to 51, and we'll start off by looking at Ernest Bevin. Bevin was close to Clement Attlee, and he was to the right of the Labour Party, closer to the centre, which meant he was an anti-communist, anti-Soviet and pro-USA Foreign Secretary, who, for example, supported the USA during the 1948 Berlin blockade. His drive was to keep Britain as a world power, and he established a role that Britain was to play for the next 50 years over the period of the course of his study during his time as Foreign Secretary, and he established that in the 1940s, which was a triumph for the centre and the right of the party over the left, who were more willing not to look to America, but to either stay independent or look closer towards Russia for help. One of the main things Ernest Bevin did was to help set up or convince America to introduce the Marshall Plan and give Marshall aid. Now, Britain had been extremely hard hit by the Second World War, and initially America had not given as a favourable loan. But when Britain told USA it was pulling out of Turkey and Greece because it couldn't afford to keep troops there, America started giving money in return for trade concessions that were given to them, and that amount turned out to be $15 billion, of which Britain got 10%. This is a major achievement of Ernest Bevin, as he was the one who convinced the Americans of the need to shore up against communism in Europe and protect international trade. But it angered the left wing of the Labour Party. It was pretty much sticking two fingers up to our wartime ally of Russia, and some would say on the left that it created this beggar and master status between us and America and reduces and has reduced our independence from that moment on. Another thing he was very majorly involved in was setting up of NATO. Now, the Brussels Pact, which was led by Bevin in 1948 to set up the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation in the next year, 1949, as a defensive alliance against the USSR and their expansion. Because the USSR had taken over Eastern Europe by fairly violent methods, although Britain had officially recognised the Eastern European communist countries. There were 10 countries that signed it in 1949, including ourselves and the USA. It pretty much meant that America had committed to defend Europe. Another major factor in foreign policy was decolonialism after the Second World War, and World War II had made people realise that possession of colonies was unbearable, partly due to the early defeats they suffered in those colonies during World War II. And World War II is now dominated by two anti-colonial superpowers, the USA and the USSR. There's also the fact that Gandhi had stepped up his campaign during World War II to get Britain out of India, and the Labour Party themselves were more committed in 1945 than Conservatives would have been, as Churchill was very anti-decolonialism. They were committed to independence for India. Britain was still looking at Africa, though, in a slightly different way to India. They thought to be more adaptable, and that there were too many problems in India and it wasn't making a profit for the sterling area, so we were more likely to get rid of India. But the problem was when and how, because there was a lot of different religious and ethnic groups in India, including Muslim, Hindu and Sikhs as well as Christian. Eventually partition was settled on with Lord Mountbatten's plan, and unfortunately it led to cross-migration between Pakistan and India, and that also resulted in bitterness and lots of violence, with up to 3 million people dead. Burma and Sri Lanka followed in 1948, and then Britain left Palestine rather than put the UN partition plan that they come up with into action. That created an Arab-Israeli war. Overall, the sterling area that was established in World War II continued as a source of earning American dollars for Great Britain, but this was accepted by the USA because of the threat of communism around the world. You also have to remember that national service is going on during this time. It was introduced in 1947 to keep the army numbers up. That started off as being a 12-month period, then went up to 18 months, and then by 1950 it was 24 months, 2-year period of national service. A lot of those people doing national service went to fight in the Korean War. Mao had taken over China in his communist victory in 1949, and Britain wanted to retain trade links, and they officially recognised China in 1950. Korea, meanwhile, south of China, had been divided after World War II along the 38th parallel. Well, communist North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, and US troops went into the south under UN supervision. Chinese troops went to war for the north, and Britain sent 10,000 troops to help the UN. Britain needed to back America for continued help in Europe, is what Derek Murphy has said is the case. Britain was maybe even a restraining influence on America to persuade them not to commit a nuclear attack. The cost of defence rose as the war with the USA was predicted by the military, causing the balance of payments crisis. 8% of GDP in 1950, 14% of GDP was spent on defence by 1951, and even though the fighting ended in 1951, an armistice was signed in 1953. It had caused a split in the Labour, helped cause a split in the Labour Party between Bevin and Gateskill. Now, Britain had also been deciding whether to continue with the nuclear deterrent, and in 1945 the Gen 75 Atomic Bomb Committee was set up. We wanted a joint USA-British nuclear programme. The USA did not, and their McMahon Act in 1946 explains that. But Bevin, having been spoken to, by the American Foreign Secretary and spoken down to, has been quoted as saying, "We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack on top of it." And he said that in 1946. In 1947, Gen 163, in that the Attlee government committed to an independent nuclear deterrent to provide us with a seat at the top table, so to speak. And that was after a report from William Penny on its viability. The development of nuclear weapons led to a world where empire was not necessary for power, but this decision to take, or to actually continue with an independent nuclear deterrent, was kept secret from other MPs. Now, the two chancellors, Hugh Dalton and Stafford Cripps, were both against it for economic reasons, but they were persuaded that we needed nuclear power in a civilian form, which would help us create electricity, and so they therefore agreed to the nuclear deterrent. In Europe, Britain, or Bevin, rejected this idea of a third force, so that Europe could be another superpower in between America and Russia, basically because Britain was too poor and Europe was too poor to create a third force. In 1950, the Schuman Plan was strongly supported by the USA and GB, says Chris Rowe, to stop future wars by pooling the coal and the steel, war resources, and to help Europe recover. But Bevin didn't want to join, he didn't want a loss of sovereignty, and they set up the Council of Europe, which is kind of more loosely-based group of nations instead. The European coal and steel community was set up, and the door was wide open for us to come in up until around about 1957. There is a story that Herbert Morrison, when Schuman called to ask whether we were going to join, said the Durham miners won't wear it, I'm afraid, because obviously they're very involved in the coal industry, and if they're digging it up just to share it with the French and the Germans, the losers club, then Morrison, obviously a left-wing Labour politician, was not going to agree for that to happen. Rose also said that public opinion was against joining, and not joining actually wasn't seen as a momentous decision. It wasn't as though, oh, this could change our country for a long time. With hindsight, we know it's now probably quite different. And like I said before, a lot of people thought it wasn't Britain's affair. We were the victors, and we didn't want to be in the losers club. Right, so some historical interpretation. Harold Wilson thinks Indian independence was this Labour government's finest achievement. Rowe says Bevin was most determined following Churchill's footsteps, and that Rowe said that disengaging from India was a necessary step. He also says that European leaders were not as eager for British leadership in Europe as our leaders supposed they would be. Traditionalist historians say Bevin, as I said, that Soviet aggression made anti-Soviet policies necessary, and Bevin himself said in 1948, if only we pushed on and developed Africa, we could have had the USA dependent on us and eating out of our hands in 4 or 5 years. Revisionists say that USSR had a right to dominance in the East, and the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan made relations worse. Post-revisionists say that there was a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunication this time between all parties concerned. Clement Attlee said on the 66 countries, very recently this country had to spend a great deal of blood and treasure rescuing 4 of them from attacks by the other 2, which explains why they didn't want to join. Derek Murphy says Britain is still one of the world's major military powers at this point. Anne Dayton says Britain thought it should determine international affairs because of experience in these matters in the past, having been the world's policeman in the previous century. The third force was supported by the left of the Labour Party, as it would ensure British neutrality between America and Russia. Edmund Dell believed that Britain missed the bus when Bevin failed to participate in the Schuman Plan talks in 1950, and Young and other revisionists say that we did think about it considerably. Because coal and steel are important to Labour, we just nationalised them, we were also the strongest in Europe in those areas. The French gave us just 24 hours to accept the invitation to attend Schuman's talks, and that's where you get the Herbert Morrison quote about the Durham miners won't wear it. Britain managed to decolonise well, Andrew Marr says, but maybe that's too comfortable a conclusion. And Marr also says the bomb is all about the Americans' status and bulldog pride. Right, that's the end of that one. Next up will be Britain and the economy in 1945 to 1951.